Have you ever wondered what happens when a man becomes so powerful, so immense, that he believes he's outgrown God himself? What happens when pride doesn't just whisper, but roars like a storm, shaking the very foundations of heaven and earth? We are about to journey back to a time lost to memory, an age when legends walked in flesh and blood, and the world trembled beneath the feet of giants. This is the story of the last of a fearsome lineage, a king whose shadow stretched for miles and whose arrogance sought to swallow the sun. His name was Og, the colossal king of Bashan, and his fall wasn't just a battle, it was a reckoning that echoes through eternity. Forget everything you think you know about ancient history. This isn't a dusty tale from a forgotten book. This is a story of divine judgment, a terrifying and awe-inspiring clash between human pride and heavenly power. What you are about to hear will chill you to the bone and challenge the very core of your beliefs. So, lean in closer, and listen, because the fall of this giant is a mirror, and in it, we might just see a reflection of ourselves. Long before the world knew of Rome or Greece, in a land carved from black basalt and ancient secrets, lay the kingdom of Bashan. This was a realm of shadows and stone, where colossal fortresses clawed at the sky and primeval forests whispered tales of an age when men were titans. And ruling over this formidable land was a man who was more myth than mortal, Og, king of Bashan. He was a remnant of the Rephaim, a race of giants spoken of only in hushed, fearful tones. But Og was not always a king who made the earth tremble. He was once a child, dwarfing the other children, learning the ancient ways of his people from his father. His father, a wise and weary giant, once told him, Og, our strength is a gift from the earth and the sky. But it becomes a chain, a curse, the moment it refuses to kneel to something greater than itself. These were words that would haunt Og, words that he would one day choose to forget, to his eternal peril. As Og grew, so did his insatiable hunger, not for food, but for permanence, for a legacy carved in stone that would defy time and even the gods. He commanded his people to build 60 fortified cities, walled citadels with high walls, gates, and bronze bars that seemed to pierce the heavens. He didn't just build cities, he molded the very landscape to his will, carving roads through mountains and raising fortresses so immense they blotted out the sun. His physical presence was so overwhelming that no wooden bed could bear his weight. So, he commissioned a bed of iron, a monstrous creation over 13 feet long and 6 feet wide. This wasn't for comfort, it was a throne of arrogance, a defiant declaration to the world, I am Og, and I am beyond the scale of ordinary men. His people, trapped between fear and awe, showered him with titles, the living pillar, the thunder of the north, son of the watchers. And Og, basking in their adoration, began to believe he was a god in his own right. Meanwhile, whispers began to drift in from the southern deserts, carried on the wind like grains of sand. They spoke of a nation of former slaves, the Israelites, led by a prophet named Moses and a mysterious pillar of cloud and fire. Og, seated on his iron throne, would laugh dismissively, raising a goblet of the finest wine. Slaves and wanderers, he would scoff. What can they know of true power? They are nothing but a fairy tale with sandals. But the whispers grew into a storm of rumors, each more incredible than the last. A sea had parted, an entire Egyptian army was swallowed by the waves, plagues had brought the mightiest empire to its knees, and cities were falling before these wanderers who fought not with chariots and iron, but with faith in a divine presence. Og tried to ignore it, to drown the stories in wine and feasting. But then, a scout returned from the frontier, his face pale, his tunic stained with blood, and his eyes wide with a terror Og had never witnessed before. They are coming, the scout stammered, and they sing. That night, as a strange wind howled through the stone halls of his palace, the giant king of Bashan, for the first time in his life, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Something eternal was drawing near, and it was a force his stone walls and iron will could not stop. The pressure was building across Bashan, a palpable tension that felt like the moments before a lightning strike. The rumors were no longer distant whispers, they were now the talk of every marketplace, every tavern, every soldier's barracks. The Israelites were on the move, and their advance was unlike anything the world had ever seen. They didn't march with the clang of armor and the pounding of war drums. They walked with a quiet, unnerving confidence, as if the outcome of their battles had already been decided in the heavens. Stories of their conquests preceded them, tales that defied all logic. The impenetrable walls of Jericho had crumbled not to siege engines, but to the sound of trumpets and a triumphant shout. The powerful Amorite kings, Sihon and his armies, had been utterly vanquished. And the Israelites, they didn't offer battle cries of rage, they sang hymns of worship, their voices rising in a chorus that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. OG's generals grew restless. One, a grizzled veteran of 100 battles, approached the king with a troubled look. "My king," he said, "their leader, Joshua, he does not shout commands. He stands still, as if listening to the wind, and yet the elements themselves seem to obey him." Another scout, who had ventured close to the Israelite camp, returned trembling. "They walk without fear," he reported, "because they truly believe they are not alone. There is a presence with them, a power that cannot be seen but can be felt." In a fit of rage and denial, Og summoned his priests. They performed the ancient rituals, burning incense and casting lots, but the omens were unclear, and the air remained heavy with a sense of impending doom. One of his most trusted advisors dared to ask the question that was on everyone's mind: what if their God is real? Og, in a fury, struck the man down. But later that night, alone in the vast emptiness of his iron-clad chambers, Og found himself staring eastward, toward the encroaching darkness. He was haunted by his father's long-forgotten words: "Giants fall hardest when they bow to no one." Og had never bowed. Not to man, not to beast, not to any god. Yet, a cold dread whispered in his soul, "This is no ordinary war. This is a divine tide, and it would not stop for thrones, for crowns, or for giants." On the eve of the battle, the city of Edrei was a spectacle of defiance. Every wall was lined with torches, the flames licking at the night sky. The air was thick with the smell of roasting meat and the sound of pounding drums. It was a feast meant to project strength, to shout their invincibility into the face of the coming storm. But on his throne of iron, Og was a statue of silence. He lifted his massive goblet, but his eyes were distant, gazing past the feasting and the flames to the unnerving stillness of the valley beyond. There, the camp of Israel was a stark contrast. No roaring fires, no glinting blades, only the faint, haunting sound of voices rising in prayer and song. A captain approached Og, his voice barely a whisper. "My king, they do not prepare as we do. They read from scrolls, they sing to their God, they pray." Og said nothing. He thought of his iron bed, his monument to his own immensity. Tonight, it felt less like a symbol of his power and more like a cold, heavy tombstone. Restless, the giant king left the feast and walked the lonely parapets of his fortress. The wind was sharp and carried a strange, electric charge. Below, his kingdom lay silent, but he could feel something moving in the darkness, a presence that was not sound, not movement, but a weight on his very soul. He had mocked their stories, ridiculed their faith, dismissed their God as a phantom of the desert. But now, as the sound of their worship drifted up from the valley, Og, the giant who feared nothing, felt the icy grip of a terrifying truth. This wasn't a war between nations, it was a confrontation between his colossal pride and an unseen, holy God. Back in his chamber, he drew his great sword, a blade longer than most men were tall. It had crushed rebellions and built his empire. But now, in his hand, it felt alien, as if it no longer recognized his authority. He looked toward the Israelite camp one last time and whispered into the darkness, not a prayer to a God he denied, but a plea to the silence itself: "If I am to fall, let them remember that I stood." But the only answer was the howling wind and the inexorable approach of a power that was about to bring him to his knees. The dawn did not break, it shattered the sky, spilling a blood-red light over the land of Bashan. An unnatural silence had fallen. The birds did not sing, the wind did not stir, and even the wild animals had fled the hills. Og stood on the battlements of Edrei, a towering figure against the fiery sunrise. Below him, his army, thousands of warriors strong, stood ready. Their polished armor gleamed, their shields formed an impenetrable wall of iron. Yet, there were no cheers, no roars of defiance. Because across the field, the army of Israel had appeared, and they had come not with the clamor of war, but with a terrifying, holy silence. They advanced in a slow, unbroken formation. No chariots, no trumpets, only the rhythmic sound of their footsteps on the earth. And then, a sound began to rise, a sound that was more powerful than any war cry. It was the sound of worship, a deep, resonant chorus of voices declaring not what they would do, but what their God had already done. Og felt it before he could understand it, a pressure in the air, a trembling deep within the stone beneath his feet. It was a heaviness not of numbers, but of holiness. One of his priests, his face ashen, gasped, "My king, heaven itself is watching this battle." Og didn't respond. He knew this was no longer his battle to command. Then, through the ranks of the Israelites, he saw him, Joshua. He wasn't marching or shouting. He was simply standing, his staff in hand, his gaze fixed on Og. And behind him, though invisible to the eye, was a power so immense, so absolute, that Og could no longer deny its existence. The great sword in Og's hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy. His legendary strength, the force that had shattered city gates, abandoned him. His heart hammered in his chest, not with the adrenaline of battle, but with the dawning horror of conviction. The wind, which had been still, now swept through the valley, a divine breath that seemed to pull the very sky downward. In that moment, all of creation held its breath, waiting for a command not from a king, but from the King of Kings. Og gritted his teeth, not in anger, but in sheer dread. He had built his kingdom on the foundation of his own might, and now he stood on holy ground. And Bashan, with all its stone, its pride, and its iron, trembled. The God of Israel had arrived. At the gates of his own fortress, Og stood stripped of everything that had defined him. No crown adorned his head, no armor protected his body. All he held was a sword that felt too heavy and a silence that was deafeningly loud. His warriors, once so confident, now looked upon him with confusion and fear. The drums of Bashan were silent. The fires had died down. Across the field, the Israelites stood motionless, their eyes fixed on him. Then, Joshua began to walk forward, alone. He carried no shield, no blade, only the quiet certainty of a man who knew he was not walking alone. An invisible, irresistible force moved with him, and Og felt it in the marrow of his bones. He could charge, he could roar, he could swing the sword that had humbled kings. But when he tried to raise it, his muscles refused to obey. The strength that had been his God had now become his betrayer. His grip slackened, his knees buckled, and with a deafening clang, his legendary sword fell to the dust. He looked into Joshua's eyes and saw no hatred, no malice, only an unwavering, unyielding truth. In that moment of shattering clarity, Og understood. This was never about armies or land. It was about his pride, a mountain of arrogance, colliding with the infinite holiness of God. The mighty walls of his fortress still stood, but they no longer offered any protection. The iron throne behind him was not a seat of power, but a cold, empty tomb of his own making. Joshua raised his hand, not to strike, but to affirm what heaven had already decreed. The earth beneath Og's feet trembled, not from the march of armies, but from the weight of divine judgment. The cracks in the kingdom of Bashan began not from the outside, but from within the heart of its king. Og, the last of the giants, took one final step, not to fight, not to flee, but to fall. He collapsed to his knees, his once mighty hands now open and empty. The giant fell, not to a sword, not to a man, but to the overwhelming presence of the God he had dared to mock. The silence that followed was heavier than any stone in Bashan. The battle was over before it had begun. The gates of Edrei stood open, shattered not by force, but by a divine verdict. The Iron Throne was empty, its shadow a long, cold stain on the ground. When the people of Bashan emerged from their homes, they stared not at the victorious Israelites, but at the empty space where their invincible king had stood. His colossal sword lay half-buried in the dirt, unclaimed. His iron bed, the symbol of his unmatched power, now stood as a silent, stark warning. An old priest, trembling, spoke for them all, "Leave it. Let it remain, so the world will remember what happens when a man builds a throne for himself and leaves no room for God." And so they did. The Israelites walked through the conquered cities not with shouts of triumph, but with a quiet reverence. This was not their victory, it was a demonstration of God's supreme authority. The story of Og and his iron bed would be told for generations, not to glorify the giant, but to serve as a chilling reminder of the fate of unchecked pride. The bed was a relic not of greatness, but of arrogance, a monument to a man who thought he was too big to bow. It whispered a timeless truth to all who would listen: no fortress is too high, no army is too strong, and no king is too mighty to be humbled by a single breath from the Almighty. The fall of Og reveals a profound and unsettling truth. We all build our own iron beds, thrones of career, reputation, intellect, and control. We trust in what we can see, what we can measure, what we can build with our own two hands. But the story of Bashan is a stark warning that any foundation not built on the rock of humility before God is destined to crumble. It teaches us that the greatest battles are not won with swords and shields, but with faith and surrender. So, look within. What iron beds have you built in your own life? What mountains of pride stand in defiance of the heavens? Because when God decides to walk through your Bashan, it is not the sound of the fall that matters. It is the deafening silence that follows, the moment when all our self-made kingdoms have turned to dust, and only one true king remains standing.